gotta get, that's all. This is a good review. You can pay attention to this. You're getting all 4 weeks right here. Here we go. Okay, here we go. So, we talked first about the supremacy of Yahweh. And if you remember, we said that that's at the very heart of Deuteronomy's vision. That if the people of Israel in Moses' day didn't get that right, nothing else mattered. In other words, if they compromised in their devotion to God, if they started bringing in other gods or other ideas or anything and put that in the parallel place to God, they were going to fail at being the people of God. And so the supremacy of Yahweh was the thing that grounded all of this, all aspects of Deuteronomy's vision. And then we talked about the religious significance of all of life, noting that part of what Deuteronomy is saying is that all of life matters to God. There's no part of life that God is uninterested in, and that every moment of every day is an opportunity to show loyalty to God or to show disloyalty to God. There's no neutral ground. There's nothing that God is uninterested in or that doesn't matter. And then last week we talked about the fact that the people of Israel are the people of Yahweh, and they were given a mission. They were given a special calling to be the people of God, to live in a certain way, and to build a different kind of community that is a witness to the world around them. And we talked about the fact that the establishment of that kind of community, that identity as the people of Yahweh, is meant to be an invitation to the people to come in. And so we talked about how the Gentiles who come in, or the invitation to the Gentiles, is to become functionally Israelite and identify with Israel, and in that way have access to God. And then, of course, Jesus redefines that around himself, so that if anyone wants to become a part of the community of the people of God, they need to identify with him, not become functionally Israelite, but identify with him. And the last aspect of Deuteronomy's vision that we're going to talk about is the one we're going to talk about today. The people of Yahweh are a community of brothers. The people of Yahweh are a community of brothers. Now, before we jump into that, I want to just say that this does not exclude women. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12, it says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman. So when Deuteronomy is talking about brothers, it's explicit in including women in that. And I say that just because sometimes there can be questions about that. Is this meant to be exclusive? Is this the men only? But in this instance, it includes women. By the way, this is unknown in the ancient Near Eastern world. This is unusual in the ancient Near Eastern world to spell out the inclusion of women in this kind of a way, particularly when it comes to something like this, where it talks about the freeing of slaves in that context. And so when we talk about a community of brothers, I'm going to use that language, but I want to be clear that I'm using that term in the Deuteronomic sense. How's that for an adjective that you didn't know existed? But I'm using that in the sense that Deuteronomy is using it, namely inclusive of women. So the people of Yahweh are a community of brothers, including both men and women. I want to look at this and why this matters. Now, this is a text that we looked at last week. This is Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. And it's known as the law of the king. And I know it's hard to see on here, so I'll read it out. When you come to the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since Yahweh has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So last week we talked about this passage, and we noted that this is radical in the ancient Near Eastern world. There's no other text of any of the ancient Near Eastern materials that we found that have this kind of limitation on the power of the king. And we noted that it denies to the king all the sorts of perks and powers that ancient Near Eastern kings were exercising, and in fact Israelite kings ended up exercising and doing in violation of this command. So it's kind of a radically countercultural stance that is being commanded here. And this week I want to focus on verse 20, where it talks about this, that the one positive command that the Israelite king is given is that he can't acquire gold and silver and horses and military might, all those different things and all that. What he is supposed to do is to be a student of Torah, to be a student of God's word. And this is how he is supposed to exercise kingship. And again, it's very, very odd from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, this approach. But in verse 20 it says that he's supposed to, verse 19, he's supposed to read from the book of the law, the book of this law, so it's actually a reference to the book of Deuteronomy. This, by the way, is where we get the name Deuteronomy for the book. It comes from a mistranslation from the Hebrew into Greek, and so it talks, instead of saying a copy of this law, it talks about a second law, and that's what Deuteronomy means, second law. And it's, of course, not a second law, it's a series of speeches or sermons on the law. But it says he's supposed to keep a copy of this law, and he's supposed to keep it with him, read it all the days of his life, and he may learn to fear Yahweh his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. Verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from them. So you see that from the conception of Deuteronomy, what God is saying through Moses to the people is that the community of the people of God is to be a community of brothers. Even the king is not to see himself as above his brothers. And we noted that includes women, according to Deuteronomy 15:12. So what we begin to see in this is that part of Deuteronomy's vision is the creation of a radically countercultural community. A radically countercultural community that's marked by brotherhood, that's marked by loyalty to God, and is going to be different from all the people around them. And if they did this, they would be standing out on the world stage, and through the way that they live, inviting people into relationship with God to come and be a part of the community of the people of God. So it begins, even the king, the most powerful political office in the nation, is to see himself as a brother. And he's not supposed to elevate himself above others. And then we see in chapter 15 another place where you see this radically countercultural nature of the society being established. Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 through 11. At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because Yahweh's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for Yahweh will bless you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of Yahweh your God. Be careful to do all this commandment that I command you today. For Yahweh your God will bless you, as he promised you, and you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow, and you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that Yahweh your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because for this, Yahweh your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. For I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. So a couple things I want to say about this. First of all, this law is obviously regulating something that is not explicitly religious. And remember when we talked about, in the second week, we talked about the religious significance of all of life. And we talked about how sometimes people will divide the law into civil law, to ceremonial law, and moral law, and then think we only have to care about the moral law. This would be an example of a civil law, and yet there are moral implications to this law. How people are being cared for within the community, and the nature and the identity of this community is being established so that the people of Israel are different from the people around them. Because going back to the supremacy of Yahweh, if Israel looks like everybody else, they can't be witnesses for God. If they don't live differently, they can't be witnesses for God. So what we have in this passage is a law regulating debts. That at the end of every 7 years, there's to be a release of debts. And what I want to suggest to you is that what Moses is doing is establishing a principle in Israel that there is not to be the emergence of a permanent underclass. Now, it might seem weird to talk about that and, talk about class and things like that, but that's a reality in every human society where you have the haves and the have-nots. You have the powerful, you have the powerless. And that's just a fact of life. And what Deuteronomy, though, is doing is it's trying to regulate this, to ensure that there is no permanent underclass that emerges. Now, the kind of debts that are being talked about could become crippling for someone. And someone might have to then sell their property. Remember, the land was divided among the various tribes and assigned to people. So when they come into the land, there should be no problems. Everybody has their plot of land. Everybody is able to farm and raise crops or raise livestock or whatever it is that they want to do or feel called to do. And so they can do that. But there can be situations where sometimes through mismanagement, sometimes through drought or anything like that people find themselves unable to support themselves. So they borrow money. And you can imagine that this can be exacerbated by a number of years of drought or, again, mismanagement or anything like that, to where someone has to sell their property or mortgage their property. And they've then lost their property. They're in debt, and they have no way of paying the debt back. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But what this law is intended to do is to ensure that there is not a permanent, that's not a permanent situation for anyone. That at the end of 7 years, things are restored. This, by the way, is where we get our bankruptcy laws and the restoration of your credit score and things like that at the end of 7 years. But the idea is that at the end of 7 years, everything is reset. And there are other resets that take place. The year of Jubilee, you're probably familiar with. At the end of 50 years, so 7 sevens, then there's the year of Jubilee. Then all the property that's been sold goes back to the original owners. So that you've got this reset, so that somebody who has managed to amass significant amounts of land will not then keep that forever. That it's reset. Now, for those of us living in the 21st century United States, this might seem just crazy to us. It might rub up against our good capitalist instincts and things like that. What about private property and the rights of people? If they buy it legitimately from their neighbor, why do they have to give it up after in the year of Jubilee or something like that? And of course it does. But the fact is there is a principle that is more important than that from at least Moses' perspective, and that is the principle that you don't have a permanent underclass emerging, and that simply because of good fortune that someone has, that they will in perpetuity be able to have more than someone else. And I would argue that the people knew the rules going in. They understood when you buy property, you're essentially buying it until the next year of Jubilee. You're not buying it forever, and that's well understood and recognized coming into this. But it's a way of making sure that you don't perpetuate a situation where someone has more than someone else forever, and that someone doesn't have a chance to gain property for themselves. We have another release that takes place. I don't have a slide for that, but also in Deuteronomy 15, the beginning of which was in 15:12 that I mentioned before, and that is the release of slaves. And this is another attempt to make sure that there's not a permanent underclass that is established in Israel. And it's important that we understand that the slavery that's being envisioned here in Deuteronomy is not what we know in the modern world of slavery. This was debt slavery. And so a person who found themselves in debt would sell themselves into slavery. So they would sell their work, their labor, essentially, for usually a period of time. And of course, Deuteronomy regulates that period of time and says it can be no more than 7 years. That there's not going to be a permanent slave class in Israel. But it's not that the person who buys the slave then owns them as property in the way that we know it in the modern world. They would live in their own home, potentially. They might live in their master's home, but they might live in their own home and come to their master's place and do the work and get food. And that's the way that they're going to take care of their family. I'm not suggesting it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a pleasing and pleasant thing for them, but it is different from what we know of in terms of slavery. But there again, the idea is that at the end of every 7 years, the debt is paid, and so things are restored. And let's go ahead, if you have a Bible, flip open to Deuteronomy 15, and we'll take a look at that, because I want to just note this principle here. All right, so it says in Deuteronomy 15, we already noted verse 12, when they're in the 7th year you must let them go free. Notice verse 13. When you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as Yahweh your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that Yahweh your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. So when someone is going to be set free, they're to be given the possibility of breaking free from the cycle that got them into that situation to begin with. So they're not to be, they paid off their debt at the end of in the 7th year, but they're not to just be sent away and they have nothing. So they then have to go sell themselves to somebody else. They're to be given something so they can start over, that they have a chance to do this. Why? Why do they do this? Because they were all slaves at one time. Because they're a community of brothers. Because they are family. And there's an obligation to care for one another. In the book of Deuteronomy, there are 4 essentially landless groups that are identified. You have the poor that we just talked about. So people who have had to mortgage their property or sell their property in order to be able to survive. Maybe they're slaves. So what Deuteronomy calls the poor. Then you have aliens, which are foreigners. And these would be people who are not just passing through. These would be people like Ruth, who are ethnically non-Israelite, but who have come into the community of the people of God, have become functionally Israelite, as we said, and want to identify with the people of God, and in that way participate in the life of the people of God. They weren't allowed to own property, and so that's why Ruth has to have her inheritance redeemed by Boaz in the book of Ruth. And so you've got the poor who own no property. Then you've got aliens who don't own property, foreigners, orphans, so people whose parents have died, they have no property, and widows. Women weren't allowed to own property in this time. So for all the egalitarian aspect that I just talked about, it's not complete in that regard. Women couldn't own property. I'm sorry. There's another group, a fifth group, and that is the Levites. The Levites don't own property. You might recall that when Moses is dividing the land, he doesn't give a set of territory to the Levites. What this means is that these landless groups have to be cared for in some other way. In other words, you can't say to someone who can't own property, well, just go and grow your own crops, and then you'll be fine. You can eat what you've got, or you can sell what's left. If they can't own land, they can't do that. And that's true for the poor, for aliens, for orphans, for widows, and for the Levites. And what you find is that care of the landless groups is a measure at how the people are doing at being the people of God. Because if we notice, it says in verse 10, you should give to him freely, talking about the person when you're releasing debts, because your heart shall not be grudging. God will bless you in all your work and that you undertake. As you read through the book of Deuteronomy, you find it's almost embarrassing in its discussion of the material wealth that's going to be poured out on the nation. Now, please understand, I'm not talking about a prosperity gospel. I'm not saying that's a measure of faithfulness or that sort of thing. But God is a generous God. God wants to bless his people. And he says, I'm going to do this. This is a land flowing with milk and honey, he says. And so I'm going to bless you abundantly, is his message. And so he's going to bless them abundantly. And they, in turn, are supposed to care for the landless groups in Israel. Now, if we think of the Levites as sort of the paradigmatic example of the landless, think about what we know about the Levites. How do the Levites get their food? It's not a trick question. Say again? At the temple. Right. So people bring, and who's bringing the food there? It's the worshipers, right? So the average Israelite is bringing their tithes. They're bringing the portions of the grain, of the fruit, of all these things. And then there's the sacrifices that are there. The burnt offering is completely consumed on the altar, but every other offering is consumed either by the worshiper or the priest or both. And that's the way that the priests and the Levites get their food, is from the faithfulness of the Israelites, right? So, let's say you have in Israel at some point in its history a Levite who's starving. What does that say about how the community is doing? A starving Levite. They're failing, right? They're failing at being the people of God because God set that up. That is the mechanism by which they get their food. The Levites are established as a barometer, as a measure for how the people of God are doing at being the people of God. So they don't have to wonder when it comes to how they're doing. They just look around and say, are there a bunch of well-fed Levites? We're doing okay. That's not the only measure. But certainly, if you got a bunch of starving Levites, there's a problem. Because God establishes that as the means by which they're going to be provided for. And the same is true for the aliens, for the orphans, the widows, and the poor. Notice in the passage that we're looking in verse 4, it says, there will be no poor among you, for Yahweh will bless you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess. We could better translate perhaps, there should be no poor among you, right? Because the principle is that if God blesses the whole nation, and the people are seeing their fellow Israelites as brothers and sisters, then they should be cared for. Remember, in this culture, in this society, the care for family was an absolutely vital requirement. This is why Naomi, again, I've referred to the book of Ruth a lot because in some ways it's Deuteronomy in action. And Naomi goes back to Israel because she knows that in Israel, her extended family has an obligation to take care of her because they're family. And what Deuteronomy is saying is that the whole community is the family. They're all brothers. So if one of your fellow Israelites is starving, you've got to help them. You've got to provide for them. So he's saying there should be no poor. There should be no poor among you. But then we notice in verse 11 it says, there will never cease to be poor in the land. So what's that about? Well, I think what Moses is doing is establishing in verse 4 the principle. There's no reason there should be poor in the land. Because God's going to bless the people and they're going to share it with others. At least they're supposed to. But he also recognizes that that's not going to happen. Because they're fallen people. They're like us. We wouldn't do any better. I want to be clear about that. But they're like us. They're fallen human beings who are selfish, who put their needs ahead of others, who judge according to different standards. All sorts of reasons why they might do this. So you have this kind of balance between the ideal and the real going on here. That there's no reason that there should be poor among the Israelites, but there will be, because they're hard-hearted. So there's a righteousness that's short of the ideal that is legislated, namely that you release people from their debts after a certain time. But the alien, orphan, widow, Levite, and the poor is a measure of the success of the people in being the people of Yahweh. And I don't think it's too strong to say that from the perspective of Deuteronomy, that if any of those landless groups is starving, they are failing at being the people of God, period. And there's no explanation or say, well, but they deserve it or this sort of thing. There's no questions about that. It doesn't say, the Levite, don't bring food to a lazy Levite or to an immoral Levite. You provide. You simply provide. God will judge and deal with that sort of thing. So care for landless groups is an important measure of the success of the people at being the people of Yahweh. And this is intentional. God sets it up this way so that there is the blessing. And it's a very different way of approaching things. We come at this with our 21st century mindset, and which of course is normal for us to do. We got to get ourselves out of that mindset to say this is something different is being established. God is establishing a radically countercultural community, something that's very different from the communities of the people around them, and different from what we have today. As a comparison, in other cultures around Israel, you have in legislation, so in their legal material, you have the establishment of classes. And you have differences in how people are treated depending on their status in society. So in Mesopotamia, for example, in Babylon, there's a class of people that are the highest class. And if someone were to assault a member of that class, they're put to death because they didn't kill that person, but they assaulted that person, and they're put to death. But if a person of that class kills someone from a lower class, they pay a fine. They're not killed, they're not punished other than paying a fine. So there's the establishment of class in these other societies. And Deuteronomy, in particular, is conspicuous in doing something very different. It's intentional and it's radically different and countercultural. Okay, questions on that? Because I know this might be new for some of you as you haven't thought about it in this way before. What questions do you have about this?
Well, let's go back to the first few verses where it says the Hebrew as a slave.
Yep.
So there is a structure where they're not just a person may be indebted and becomes a slave, and they're not just handed to the first day that freedom.
Right.
Freedom from they have to work possibly as many as 7 years.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So it's not that there's no consequences for choices that somebody might have made. Sometimes it's out of their control, but and it could well be that somebody says, because of the amount of money that they owe, most likely they're selling themselves to somebody they owe money to. And so depending on the amount of money that they owe, it might be that the person says, well, 2 years is what's owed. And so they serve their 2 years, and then they're done. But it's no more than 7. as you know. But you're right, Ted. It's not just doesn't matter what choices you make along the way or anything. There are still these kinds of structures, which in a sense fits what Paul says. If they won't work, they won't eat. So it's not just a blank check to do whatever you want and there's no consequences to it. But it's also not, the consequences is not a life sentence or no hope for a future for the children and the grandchildren of that person.
So were they required to sell themselves into slavery, or can you expand on it a little bit?
The question was, were they required to sell themselves into slavery? No, they're required to pay the debt. So however they could pay the debt, they could do that. But for many people, that's the only option, would be to sell themselves into slavery. Presumably, they will have sold their property first, and sell off as much of their property as they could afford to pay the debt. And only when that's not sufficient would they sell themselves into slavery. But if there's some other means by which they could pay off the debt, they could do that. They don't have to do that. And interestingly, I didn't read this passage, but just after what I did read in the second part of Deuteronomy 15, it says that there could be instances where the slave says, "I don't want to be set free, and this is worked out for me, and so I want to stay." And the law provides for that. So, which again is a very different kind of a mindset. But we have to not think of chattel slavery that we know, and that it's a much different kind of institution. As I say, somebody could be living in their own home and going to work, but just not getting paid, and their food is being provided and things like that. So they're just saying, okay, this works for me, as opposed to having to manage my own farm, my own vineyard. I'm just gonna work in somebody else's and get my food, and that way.
So is it correct to say that there was no shame in that, being a slave in that sense, or you?
Well, I don't think I'd go so far as to say there was no shame in it. It was a different thing from what we might think. It was, it's still a result of some sort of problem. I mean, it might not be their fault entirely, but on the other hand, not everybody is. What we know is that when there's a broad famine, there are still people who might take advantage of that, but everybody is having problems, and you can't sell your crops, and so people want to get their money, so they might say, okay, well, we'll just extend the debt. This is a bad year, we'll extend it for another year at the end of the term, so that there's a hope of getting their debt paid. So it could be that there's some sort of mismanagement, bad luck, misfortune could do that. So I wouldn't say there's no shame in it, but it's not the same level of shame as that. Remember that this same institution of slavery was known in the first century. It's still debt slavery that we're talking about in that instance. And the early church, some of the most fruitful soil for converts were among the slaves, and so they become the church in many respects. So it's a group that exists, and they're being cared for, but I wouldn't say there's no shame in it. There's still some shame. Yes.
Does they have a requirement that you would serve in the military between a certain age, and would that take precedence over a debt if a war developed and you had to go serve?
Yeah, so there was no standing requirement for military service. It's only when they had to call up folks because of that. That would certainly take precedent over a debt, because it's the survival of the nation's at stake, and you can't quibble over distributing debts and stuff if you're conquered by another nation. Yep.
Back to chattel slavery. So if I sold myself into slavery and I die, and I have children, does that mean that they then continue that debt, or does that debt go away?
Nope, the debt will continue till the end of the 7 years. So even if it's passed on, it all ends at 7 years.
But somebody in my family would have to pick it up.
Somebody in your family would pick it up. Yep.
And then is it rolling admission slavery? Meaning, like, everybody's on the same set 7-year cycle, or is it like I started and you started yours a year later?
Yeah, that's a good question. Scholars are divided on that. We don't know for sure as to whether it was what it was. We know that the year of Jubilee was fixed, so that if you bought land, the price of land that you're going to pay or get, in year 48 is going to be significantly less than it is in year 1, because you'll own it for 2 years. It's not clear whether how this worked in terms of slavery and in terms of debt. I think the best understanding is probably that it was 7 years from the time that you, if the amount of debt warrants 7 years, that it's not, there's a fixed time that all slaves are released. It's 7 years. It's case by case, person by person. I think that's the best understanding.
So I'm not running up the credit card debt in year 6?
No. Probably not the best way to go. All right? Okay, so I want to talk about this principle. When we look at the New Testament, we start moving into the New Testament. I want to take a look at a couple of passages. Acts chapter 2, verses 44 through 47. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So here we have in the book of Acts, this is a description of the early church. Now remember that at this point, the early church were converts from Judaism. So there's not many Gentiles yet coming into the church at this point in Acts. So these are Jews who have identified with Jesus. Remember we talked about the redefinition of the people of God? How Jesus redefined the people of God around himself and invites people to identify with him if they want to be a part of the community of the people of God. So these are people who've done that. And what I want for us to note is that this radically countercultural community that Deuteronomy is envisioning is being lived out in the book of Acts, in the early church. So the early church didn't see Deuteronomy as something relegated to the dim recesses of the past that's irrelevant for their lives. They're seeing it as something relevant. All the believers were together, had everything in common. Sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. It challenges us sometimes because, again, with our sort of infusion and immersion in capitalist thinking, this strikes us as socialism. And maybe it is, but this is the idea that they're living this way. It's more explicit in Acts chapter 4. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in all of them. There were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. And what I want to note is that this is a direct quote from Deuteronomy 15:4. It's, in fact, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the tense has changed because it says there shall be no needy persons among you. But in this instance, it's a quote from that. So Acts chapter 4 is the direct application of Deuteronomy's vision. The idea that there was no needy persons among them, there were no poor among them. And this is supposed to be an arrow, not a little square. But Acts 2 and 4 is the fulfillment of Deuteronomy's vision. And I think Luke, the author of Acts, is explicitly connecting the life of the early church to Deuteronomy. And to say this is the fulfillment of that the early church was trying to live out that radically countercultural community that Deuteronomy was envisioning. And Luke is saying that they were succeeding at doing that. And so in doing that, they had no poor among them. Why? Because people were sharing what they had. They were selling. Those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. So this is that kind of community of brothers that Deuteronomy is envisioning being lived out in the early church. And so what I want to suggest is, once again, when we think about Deuteronomy's vision and the modern church, the people of God are a community of brothers. The people of God are a community of brothers. We have an obligation to see one another as brothers. And again, to, I think, resist in some ways the cultural pull that says, well, I don't have to care about other people. I care about my biological family, and that's it. I have no obligation to care about somebody else. I would suggest that when we think about the incredible material blessings that God has poured out on the American church, we have to think carefully about what God wants for us to do with that. Because I think there's a principle, I mentioned this, I think, on the first day, but there's a principle that God rarely blesses for the sake of the recipient alone. In other words, God blesses so that it can be shared. When you think about the blessing that God pours out on Abram, it's not so that Abram can get rich and have children or a child and this sort of thing. It's so that the whole world can be blessed. And when we see what we were talking about in Deuteronomy 15 about the idea there shall be no poor among you, because God is going to so bless you that you will share. You'll have enough to share if you see the community around you as the people of God and a community of brothers. So as we think about the material abundance that God has poured out on us as Americans and as the American church, I think we have a challenge to think about, what does God want us to do with that blessing? Is it for our own sake that God blesses us? Or does God want us to share that with other people in other parts of the world, perhaps, and here? It demands a change in our thinking about this. But nevertheless, it's a part, I think, of what it means to be a community of brothers, to start seeing ourselves as that. So we can ask ourselves the question, I said before that, among the Israelites, if there's starving Levites, how are the people doing at being the people of God? If there are starving Christians, brothers and sisters, in our own country or in other parts of the world, and we've got an abundance, how are we doing? How are we doing at being the people of God? I would suggest we're probably not doing very well. Or at least, at a minimum, we have to ask ourselves the question, what does God want us to do with that? Now, I'm not trying to say, again, there's all sorts of factors that play into this in terms of what's actually helpful to people and things like that. There's an organization, Poverty Cure, I think is the organization. They talk about just some of the ways that the Western church has exacerbated problems in developing countries, for example, by trying to help. And so we have to be careful that what we're doing doesn't hurt as opposed to help. There's a great book, I should have put it on here, but if you're interested in this, by a guy named Brian Fickert, and it's called When Helping Hurts. And he talks about the ways that sometimes we think we're helping, but in fact we're hurting other people with trying to be generous in these sorts of ways. So he's not saying don't be generous. He's saying be smart about how you're being generous, and don't hurt people inadvertently by doing that. But I want to suggest that that's a requirement, that we think about these kinds of things as part of our calling as being the people of God, that we don't just think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's not my responsibility. If Deuteronomy's vision is relevant for us, and Luke seems to think it is, then we have to ask that question and see what we might do about that. Questions or comments on that? All right. What I'd like to do then, for the last bit of time that we have, maybe we'll take 10 minutes or so, and at your tables, on the sheet you've got these questions, but I'd like to have you talk about these at your tables, and then maybe we'll come together as a large group and talk about these if you're willing to share. But the questions are, what aspects of Deuteronomy's vision are most relevant in your life? I can't remember if I said this, but I certainly thought it on the first day, that if at the end of this time, all that's happened is we've just learned some stuff, then we haven't really spent our time very well. We need to be changed as a result of that. We need to apply things there. So what aspects of Deuteronomy's vision are most relevant in your life? And then second, what are the greatest obstacles to you living out the Christian life in a radically countercultural way? What keeps you from being able to do that? And what is God inviting you to do differently as you seek to come out of the wilderness? We talked about the fact that we've been in the wilderness for a while in many respects. So what's God inviting you to do differently? So go ahead and talk about this at your tables, and then I'll call us back together for kind of, if you're willing to share some insights from these questions.
I know it's
We'll take one more minute and then we'll come together as a large group. One more minute.
It's easy to just kind of stay with more and feel like you're going to be okay.
Okay, let's come back together. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're thinking in terms of these questions. I hate to interrupt good conversation, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Is anybody willing to share a little bit about what you see as most relevant for your life in terms of Deuteronomy's vision? Anybody willing to share?
Sure.
Yes, please.
Our table was even something as simple as a radically countercultural way of living out your life. It was a struggle with keeping Sunday or the Sabbath or whatever holy when other extended family is frustrated with that and almost looks at it as, oh, you gotta go to church.
Mm.
You know, like if there's like a holiday or whatever, like it's really in the way
Mm-hmm.
of the family involvement, and that's something that is in some ways very simple, and yet it causes a lot of frustration and pain
Sure.
for the believer.
Yeah. Great. Others?
Even working when you're at a job, this is what I do. I do not work on Sunday.
Mm.
And every time I get a job, I don't have to work on Sunday. God blesses me for that. I take a stand for that. And I
Yeah.
stand up for that. And I make sure I put on an application, I mark the weekdays I want to work, and I make sure that I don't work on Sunday.
Yeah. Good. Others?
One of the things that we talked about was the aspect of the vision of all aspects of life having religious significance. And I know I tend to, either in actuality or mentally, kind of partition things into, professional life, family life, spiritual life,
Sure.
rather than
Yep.
really I need to be thinking about all of it
Yeah.
as having a spiritual aspect.
Yeah. So in other words, you're normal.
All right.
But wait a minute. That's not a good thing. So, what about the obstacles? You know, as you hear this vision being laid out, what are the things that keep you from living out this vision or the Christian life in a radically countercultural way? Yes.
We discussed several things there. You know, when you reach out to someone, not all are receptive.
Okay.
Secondly, is the gift that you're giving used for the intended purposes or not? And the third thing is that you worry about is the person lazy and wants to be in that style of life? Mental illness is a problem.
Sure.
Those who have met vets who have PTS. And the point was also made is one of the members here said that if I give, then I assume that the responsibility of how it's used is transferred from me to that person to be used.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So some practical considerations in terms of living out certain aspects of this stand in the way. Good. What else? I'm not a huge fan of bumper sticker theology, but there's one that I like, and it says, if someone were to accuse you of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to prove it? And it should be an open and shut case for us. And yet, I think there's a lot of anonymous Christians around where we don't live differently from the people around us. Why is that? What keeps us from doing that? Any thoughts?
I think as individuals in culture, we always want to be accepted by others around us.
Yeah.
So if we're countercultural, well, then that obviously puts us in the corner, and
Right.
nobody else will want to be around us.
Yeah, and I think, nobody wants to admit that we want to fit in. We want to fit in with our culture. We don't want to be weird. We don't want to stand out. In some ways we say we do, but the reality is I think at some level we're afraid. We're afraid of being rejected. And that keeps us from living perhaps in the way that God wants us to.
And the corollary, you don't want to reject other people.
Sure.
And so even if you're not afraid of people rejecting you, if you are acting a certain way, I go back to my hockey days, I didn't swear. And so when all my friends were, and they always felt super awkward around me.
Yeah.
Because they're just like, every time they would take God's name in vain and have all sorts of creative ways they would do things, then they always felt really awkward about that.
Yeah.
And then, that created that.
Sure. Yep. Yes.
One other point that I'd like to make is basically growing up, coming from a small community, we kind of supported the group of people in our community.
Mm-hmm.
It seems today that the idea has transferred from not me doing it, but the government should do it.
Sure. Yep. And I think that's a huge issue that needs to be wrestled with in this. Is that the best model for this? It's interesting in Deuteronomy, though there's a king, the establishment of a king and that sort of thing, you note that it doesn't say that the king is supposed to provide for the landless groups. Individual Israelites were supposed to do that. And so that's an important question. How do we relate to the state, the government, with respect to these things when the state has taken over a number of those things? Well, lastly, is anybody willing to share what God might be inviting you to do differently as a result of today's discussion or what we've discussed over the last 4 weeks? Anything you're going to try or want to do differently that you think God is calling you to do?
Well, something I've been doing with regard to the church as a whole and to myself, one of the obstacles sometimes in providing for people and taking care of others' needs is I don't have enough for me for my family. And so one of the things that I've been doing for my family and for the church is praying for financial blessings on all the members of our church. If the church needs money, which we do, to provide ministry and to do things that God's calling us to do, if we don't have it, then what are we doing?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
let's be praying that God blesses our families with good jobs and amazing things that just happen to us financially so that we can provide the ministries God is calling us to do.
Yeah.
And that would stand out. It's like,
Sure.
wow, look what they're doing even during hard times.
Right.
God is blessing them. Why is he blessing them? Why
Yeah.
is this happening?
That's great. Anything else? Anybody willing to share? Yep, Tracy.
I think along with that, we think about it's easy to think about what we can't do, and realizing that there are so many ways to come alongside people. And I'm one of those people who, when I get off at the freeway exit and come to the stop sign, and there's somebody right there with a sign saying, please help, and I don't know what help is helping and what help is hurting. And, it's easy to just not make eye contact, right? Instead of just seeing a human being there and making a connection. And you don't have to actually, you might be the person who has something to give them that day and should do that. You might actually just look them in the eye and see what they're being. And that's one easy example that we all experience. But like, how many times do I just look people in the eye and see their humanness and connect and maybe have nothing else to offer except a smile and my eye contact, and it might make a difference. Just seeing people's humanity. I listened to your talking about what kind of a king and what to do with the poor among you, and I just see the classes just collapse. I see this human, shared humanity with everybody across the board, and think, how can I just share my humanity?
Yeah, that's great. Well, our time is up. I'll be praying for you all that as you think back to this won't just be 4 weeks that you kind of sat in a class, but that God will do something with this in your life. And I appreciate your inviting me to be here. It's been great to be with you all these last weeks and to be back at Southtown after a long, long time not having been here. So thank you for having me, and God bless you, and happy Easter.